Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about Wargame Campaigns and bringing narrative into the game. This week I want to discuss campaigns and the use of narrative role-playing skills in storytelling the game. Now, I'm not just doing this because I'm a role player as well as a wargamer, although that does come into this and I'll discuss that a little bit later. The origin of today's talking point is another subscriber question, this time from Simon Stokes, who asked, I wonder what you think about running wargame campaigns. And he says, I've been involved in several different campaigns over the years, from short one-day events using quick games like DBA through to months-long mega campaigns. They can be massively rewarding to play in, especially if they play through to a conclusion. And I've had some of my most enjoyable wargaming playing in them, but equally they can fizzle out in acrimonious disagreements. So an interesting question, and I thought it was worth grasping and trying to tackle. So this is a subject that I have touched on before a few years ago, but since then I've taken part in a couple of campaign games, and I think I have perhaps a better perspective on their pros and cons. But let me start by saying that I'm taking this question and probably running with it in a slightly different direction to how Simon intended. But hopefully by the end you'll understand why I think campaigns are a good idea, and more importantly how to make them more engaging so you don't end up in acrimonious disagreement. So as I've mentioned before many times, my earliest gaming origins were with role-playing games like D&D. Indeed, I still play D&D regularly, and for many years I ran a campaign in my own world setting. Much of the material I wrote was describing the world my players would inhabit. None of it ever made it into the games themselves, but that hidden backstory gave the games extra depth and realism, despite it being a fantasy setting. So, what I had done is build a narrative that didn't feel fake, even when it was filled with dragons, elves and wizards. Now, 25 years later, I still play RPGs, but wargaming has definitely become the mainstay of my hobby. But that shouldn't mean the end of my storytelling and narrative skills. Now, one of the simple lessons I learned when writing role-playing campaigns is that crafting stories is about creating a narrative. And to do this you need characters and story arcs. So that includes peoples, places, landscapes. They're all characters in a story, and that is the same whether the game is set in Middle-earth or the 18th century Europe. The most interesting and realistic characters develop as the story unfolds because they're on a spiritual or intellectual journey, and by the end of the story they're not the same person they were when the story began. These journeys and this character development make for the most interesting and impactful stories, whether they are tales of mythical heroes or historic generals. So building character development into a game is desirable, but also considerably easier with a campaign arc that covers a period of time, multiple engagements, and this is where campaign games come into their own. So before I discuss how to create a narrative, I ought to discuss wargame campaigns. It is the subject of this question after all. Now, the Rejects have been playing a campaign now for over a year, I think it is, with most of the action taking place via email exchanges between the various generals and the Empire. After each set of orders, the results of moves and scouting and other elements like weather and supply issues are reported back to the players before a new set of orders are sent in. For most of the last year we seem to have been blundering around in the dark, unable to find our opponent's armies on the map and struggling to bring them to battle. And thus far we've had just one battle, although we may be about to have another one soon. Despite the slow pace of the campaign, it's been an interesting exercise, sometimes intriguing, often confusing and thoroughly enjoyable as a result. What we've learned is that we all enjoy the fog of war and the story that is slowly being played out over months of gameplay. So how can you put narrative and storytelling into a war games campaign? Well, to tell a good story you need, I think, 4 basic elements. There needs to be a backstory. So providing historical context for the campaign helps set the scene. Then you need to, you emphasise historical facts that help show the reasons for the conflict, the aims and the objectives that made conflict preferable to politics and negotiation. But then the second element you need are protagonists. So who are the people leading the character? Who are the leading characters on both sides? These would typically be the players and the generals they represent. And like real characters in history, they should also have qualities such as traits, flaws, strengths and weaknesses that make them unique and interesting personalities. But equally, where possible, you need to emphasise those strengths and weaknesses that clash with other protagonists, so that the story of the campaign is not just a list of supply, manoeuvres and actions fought, but also rivalries, ambitions, vengeance, retribution. Next, you need action. These are the events of the book, the film or wargame that will largely be determined by the action of the protagonists or other significant players in the story. And lastly, you need an outcome. So victory and or defeat, consequences, long-term effects need to be represented in each step of the story. The outcomes of battles should not just have consequences in terms of losses and casualties, but also personal honour, promotions, demotions, court-martials, disgrace, executions. So very quickly, you have more than just a War Games campaign. You have a network of individual stories that weave together in a much more realistic and engaging fashion. In short, you have a campaign that feels much more real. So once again, it's time to throw this out to you. Have you campaigned, and did it make you enhance your games? And have you built narrative and storytelling into those campaigns to bring the characters of the story to life? Or is it just about setting up the next tabletop game? As always, I'd love to hear your experiences and opinions on this topic in the comments below. It's now time for a hobby update. It has been a very busy week with lots of gaming of one kind or another, keeping me away from the painting workbench. On Monday, the Regics joined Jonathan Freitag from the US on Zoom for the Battle of Basagnana, which took place in September 1745. I hope I've got the pronunciation right. Myself and Steve played the Spanish-French army facing Richard, who controlled the Piedmontese army under King Emmanuel. This certainly looked like a tough battle for Richard because his army was considerably smaller than the French and Spanish. There were reserves which could attempt to come on from the 5th turn of the game, but in a game that was only scheduled to last 6 turns, he needed to roll well for those reserves to actually appear. His main defence was the line of the Tirana River to his front. However, it was fordable almost everywhere, so the French and Spanish would be slowed by the crossing but not completely restrained by it. And as the game unfolded, the main limiting factor on the French and Spanish side was the activations of divisions. Each command had a dice in the tin along with 2 end of turn dice, both of which needed to be pulled to end the turn. The winner of the initiative roll at the beginning of a turn would get 2 activations automatically to start, and the French-Spanish army was always going to be difficult, so we prioritised the Spanish troops as they had the task of breaking past King Emmanuel to capture the pontoon bridge over the River Po at his rear. However, we had 5 command dice in the tin, so most of the game, at least part of our army, didn't get to activate before the end of the turn itself. So for instance, Senetair's command never moved during the whole game, and Drugamont's command was only activated twice because most of the fighting was concentrated at the other end of the line with our Spanish troops. Now, I'm not complaining, of course, because Steve and I were able to cross the river and press our weight of numbers against the sparse Piedmontese army. There were some notable hiccups in our plan, including a surprise attack from a light infantry brigade that devastated 2 Spanish line units with flank fire. But aside from that high watermark, poor Richard was on for a hiding in this game, and by the end of turn 5, he graciously conceded the game. Once again, Jonathan had put on an interesting and challenging scenario that we all thoroughly enjoyed, and I think we're actually going to be refighting this in a few weeks' time. Then on Tuesday evening I joined my role-playing group for a continuation of our long-running D&D campaign. This is set in the DM's own world setting called Cronlon, and our little group of adventurers just set off on a side quest that may perhaps be of significance, more significance than we anticipate. My paladin character has a feeling that this is a holy quest that was foretold for him, and the outcome could be hugely significant. Only time will tell, of course. Now this game was mostly taken with our group travelling to our destination and beginning the descent into a sunken city occupied by the ghosts of its citizens, sea devils and an ancient black dragon. It's quite possible that not all of us are going to make it out alive. Then on Wednesday the rejects gathered for a rare midweek game for the first playtest of our demo for Broadside in a week's time. This is the one show where we regularly put on a game, and this time it's Ray's turn in the spotlight. Now I don't want to give away too much, but he's done an outstanding job with excellent terrain and an interesting period and lots of really amazing miniatures. Today, as this video goes out, we're actually gathering again for a full day playing the scenario and helping Ray with any last minute changes that he needs to make to either the scenario, the orders of battle or the rules. Now if you want to see us in action, of course, come and check out Ray's game in detail at Broadside Wargame Show in Gillingham next Saturday the 8th of June from 10 AM. So I want to end with a book review continuing the theme of role playing. This is a book that I read many years ago and helped shape my ideas on narrative storytelling. And while it was written with role-playing games in mind, I think that it could also help the wargamer wanting to inject more narrative and spontaneity into their campaigns and battles. So Play Unsafe, written by Graham Walmsley, was published in 2009 and it's a very slim volume, just 89 pages, and some of those are blank. Essentially it's a book about not being constrained by the rules and equipping the role player with permission to think more fluidly and to be a better storyteller. But I've begun to appreciate its value as a toolkit for better, more narrative wargaming, and it dovetails very nicely with campaign games which are all about the bigger story beyond isolated one-off battles. Now the core premise of the book is that using improvisation can change the way you think in a role-playing game. It's about finding the zen of role-playing, cutting away the rules until you're left with improvised play in its purest form. Now this isn't for every gamer's taste, so it feels, if you want safe framework of rules, then this might not be for you. And of course it's hard to fit it into a war game that has that framework. But even if you only implement a few of the ideas from this book, I think that role-playing and wargaming becomes much more spontaneous and open up to unexpected possibilities for fun. Now the author urges the umpire not to plan too far ahead. The stuff you make up on the fly is much better. When you invent it on the spot, you can see that terror in the umpire's face and it becomes much more urgent and you lose a little bit of control and anything could happen. Now most of the ideas in this book are common sense, but they've been overlooked or pushed aside by traditional game styles or rule sets that are very conscriptive. Some suggestions that may go too far for some readers, such as running a game with no notes, no rule books and no story, but there are plenty of little gems of advice that can be incorporated into your playing style, whether you're playing a role-playing game or a war games campaign. Now to quote the cover, it says it all. There are few games which would be better if they tore up 100 or so pages of rules and replaced them with the text from this book. Now while that may be harder to do with a war game, I still think the advice given in this book could benefit the umpire wanting to create a little more story development in their scenarios and to inject some narrative elements into the way they tell the unfolding of a game or a campaign. So that's it for this week. Please join the conversation in the comments below, and of course if you enjoyed the video please like, subscribe and share, and if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming and of course keep rolling high.